Footsteps crunched heavily against the frozen Montana snow, shattering the midnight silence of the Bitterroot Valley. 3 armed men thought they were hitting an easy mark, an isolated cabin owned by a frail, forgotten man. They didn't know they had just breached the perimeter of a retired Marine Force recon sniper. Axton Sanders sat in the velvet dark of his living room, perfectly still. At 62, his body bore the invisible maps of a dozen conflicts, a scarred knee from a mortar blast in Fallujah, a persistent ringing in his left ear from a close-quarters firefight in Helmand Province, and a phantom ache in his shoulder that flared whenever the barometric pressure dropped. Tonight the pressure was plummeting. A classic Montana blizzard was blowing in from the north, driving the temperature down to a bitter -10 degrees. In his calloused hands, he held a chipped ceramic mug of black Folgers coffee, the heat leaching into his palms. The only sound in the cabin was the low, rhythmic crackle of a Motorola weather radio on the kitchen counter and the steady pop of sap in the Vermont Castings wood stove. Then the rhythm broke. It was a subtle anomaly, easily masked by the howling wind, but Axton's ears were tuned to the frequency of incoming threats. It was the faint, sputtering cough of a dying engine, specifically the familiar misfire of a failing catalytic converter on an older model truck. The sound cut out roughly a half-mile down his private logging road. No one accidentally turned down Axton's road. It was unpaved, unmarked, and buried under 6 inches of fresh powder. Axton set his mug down on the reclaimed oak coffee table. He didn't turn on a lamp. He didn't rush. He simply stood, his muscles sliding into a familiar, cold-blooded operational readiness that had kept him alive through 3 combat tours. He walked silently to the front window, keeping his silhouette well away from the moonlight, spilling through the glass, and peered through the frost-rimmed pane. 3 figures were trudging up the driveway. They moved with the clumsy, hyper-alert, jerky motions of men running on adrenaline and bad decisions. Through his Bushnell binoculars, Axton analyzed them in seconds. The leader was broad-shouldered, wearing a Carhartt jacket that was too thin for the weather, clutching what looked like a sawed-off Remington 870 pump-action shotgun. The second man was shorter, twitchy, constantly looking over his shoulder, holding a cheap handgun, likely a Taurus or a High Point, at an unsafe angle. The third man lagged behind, carrying an empty nylon duffel bag and a heavy steel crowbar. Axton recognized the type instantly. These weren't professional operators or trained cartel hitters. They were local tweakers from Ravalli County, drowning in debt to some Missoula meth ring, looking for a remote score. Rumors often floated around the local hardware store about the crazy old hermit who kept a safe full of gold coins and pre-ban firearms. The rumors were half true. Axton had a considerable collection of high-end weaponry, but the gold was a myth. Outside in the freezing cold, Caleb Wyatt wiped a mixture of snot and freezing rain from his upper lip. He gripped the freezing steel of his Remington, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "Keep moving," he hissed at Toby, the younger, terrified kid, shivering beside him. "Man, I don't like this," Toby whispered, his voice cracking. He adjusted his grip on the rusted Smith & Wesson revolver he'd stolen from his uncle. What if he's awake? What if he's got an alarm? He's an old man living in the woods. "Toby," Caleb snapped, stepping onto the wooden porch. "The telecom wire is cut. I clipped it at the road. And even if he had a cell phone, there ain't no Verizon towers out here. We kick the door, we put the gun in his face, we tie him up, and we take the safe. 3 minutes in and out." The third man, a jittery mechanic named Lenny, hefted the crowbar. "Just do it, Caleb. My hands are going numb." Inside, Axton was already moving. He bypassed the heavy Fort Knox gun safe in his bedroom. Racking an AR-15 or a Mossberg would be deafeningly loud and instantly give away his position. More importantly, Axton didn't want to kill these boys if he didn't have to. A dead body meant state police, endless paperwork lawyers, and the end of his peaceful isolation. He wanted them to leave, but he wanted to break them so thoroughly they would never even look at a map of the Bitterroot Mountains again. He reached under his mattress and withdrew a customized Kimber 1911.45 ACP, checking the chamber by feel in the dark. He slid it into the small of his back. Then he strapped his old, heavily worn Ka bar combat knife to his thigh. Crack. The front door shuddered violently. Caleb had kicked it right at the deadbolt, but Axton had reinforced the doorframe with 3-inch steel screws and solid brass strike plates. The oak held firm. Crack. Damn it, it's reinforced. Caleb swore loudly. Lenny the window, smash the damn window. A second later, the heavy steel crowbar shattered the double-paned glass of the living room window. Jagged shards rained down onto the hardwood floor like diamond dust in the moonlight. Lenny reached his gloved hand through the jagged opening, fumbled for the latch and shoved the window up. A blast of freezing air and snow swirled into the cabin, instantly dropping the indoor temperature. Axton had already faded into the hallway, positioning himself in the impenetrable shadow of the mudroom archway. He controlled his breathing in for 4 seconds, hold for 4, out for 4. The box breathing technique slowed his heart rate to a steady rhythmic thump. He became a ghost in his own home. One by one, the 3 intruders tumbled through the window, their boots crunching loudly on the broken glass. Flashlights! Caleb ordered, his voice echoing in the quiet cabin. 3 cheap, erratic beams of light pierced the darkness, sweeping erratically across the vintage leather sofa, the cast-iron stove, and the empty Folgers mug on the table. "Clear the rooms," Caleb said, pumping the Remington with a loud, intimidating clack-clack. "Fine," the old man. "Lenny, check the kitchen. Toby with me to the back." From the shadows, Axton watched them separate. It was the first, most fatal mistake in close-quarters battle, CQB. You never split a poorly trained element in an uncleared, unlit environment. Axton smiled grimly. The hunt had begun. The layout of Axton's cabin was a tactical nightmare for an invading force, and he had designed it that way intentionally. There were no long sightlines. The hallway was narrow, forcing a single-file approach. The floorboards were old, settling pine, but Axton knew exactly which planks screeched and which were silent over the joists. Lenny moved toward the kitchen, his cheap LED flashlight shaking in his trembling hand. He opened cabinets, knocking over a stack of cast-iron skillets that crashed to the floor with a deafening clang. "Quiet, you idiot!" Caleb hissed from the hallway. Axton decided to take Lenny off the board first. He slipped through the secondary access door that connected the mudroom to the walk-in pantry, moving with absolute, terrifying silence. He wore soft-soled tactical moccasins. He had custom-ordered years ago footwear that allowed him to feel the floor beneath him before committing his weight. Lenny was rummaging through a drawer, his back to the pantry door, muttering to himself about finding the safe. Axton stepped out of the pantry. He didn't draw his gun. He simply reached out in the darkness, his massive, calloused left hand clamping hard over Lenny's mouth, instantly stifling his scream. Simultaneously, Axton's right arm wrapped around Lenny's throat, locking into a flawless, blood-restricting carotid chokehold. Lenny thrashed his crowbar clattering to the linoleum floor, but the veteran's grip was like an industrial vice. Axton didn't crush the windpipe. He applied precise, calculated pressure to the arteries. In less than 8 seconds, Lenny's frantic struggling slowed. 10 seconds, and the mechanic went entirely limp, sliding into unconsciousness. Axton quietly lowered Lenny to the floor, dragging him into the pantry. He took a heavy roll of industrial duct tape from the shelf and swiftly bound Lenny's wrists and ankles, slapping a strip across his mouth. One down. Not a single shot fired. Down the hall, Toby was hyperventilating. Caleb, man, I don't like this. Where's Lenny? He's in the kitchen, Caleb growled, sweeping his flashlight across the closed door of the master bedroom. Lenny, you find anything? Silence. Only the howling wind outside and the crackle of the weather radio. Lenny. Caleb called out, a sudden edge of panic slicing through his tough guy facade. Axton was already relocating. He moved through the central ventilation space, a modification he had made for optimal airflow, which also allowed him to slip between the kitchen and the back hallway unseen. He positioned himself behind a heavy oak bookcase near the bedroom door. I'm gonna check the kitchen. Toby whimpered, backing away from the bedroom door. I think something's wrong. Stay here, Caleb ordered, but Toby was already shuffling backward down the hall. As Toby backed toward the living room, Axton reached into the pocket of his tactical trousers and retrieved a heavy brass Zippo lighter. He tossed it underhand, sending it skittering across the hardwood floor into the far corner of the living room. Clatter, clatter, thud. Toby spun around, raising his rusted Smith & Wesson blindly into the dark. Who's there? I'll shoot. I swear to God, I'll shoot. Toby, shut up, Caleb yelled, rushing back down the hall toward him. Taking advantage of their distraction, Axton stepped out from behind the bookcase. He reached up to the main electrical sub-panel, hidden behind a decorative framed map of the Bitterroot Valley. With one swift motion, Axton flipped the main breaker. The low hum of the refrigerator died. The glowing red numbers on the microwave vanished. The entire cabin plunged into absolute suffocating blackness. What the hell did you do? Caleb shouted, his flashlight beam darting wildly across the ceiling. I didn't do anything. Toby screamed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched sob. Caleb, he's here. The old man is in here with us. Axton leaned against the wall, perfectly camouflaged in the pitch black. He took a slow, deep breath. It was time to start dismantling their minds. He pitched his voice low, projecting it so it seemed to bounce off the timber walls, a trick he learned in the dense urban canyons of Ramadi. You cut the telecom wire. Caleb Axton's voice floated through the dark, calm, gravelly and echoing. But you didn't account for the satellite uplink. The police aren't coming, boys. They're 30 miles out in a blizzard. Caleb whipped his flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing there but an empty chair. Where are you? Come out, you old freak. The police aren't coming. Axton repeated his voice, now seemingly coming from the kitchen. Which means it's just you, me, and the cold. Toby dropped to his knees, his flashlight rolling across the floor, casting bizarre, elongated shadows on the walls. Let's go, Caleb. Let's get out of here, please. I'm not leaving without the money, Caleb roared, aiming his shotgun into the dark. He fired a blast. The deafening roar of the 12-gauge shell shattered the night, illuminating the cabin in a split-second flash of yellow fire. Buckshot shredded the antique leather sofa, sending clouds of white stuffing into the air like snow. The ringing in Caleb's ears was immediate. He pumped the shotgun, breathing heavily, but the muzzle flash had ruined their night vision entirely. For Axton, who had kept one eye tightly squeezed shut during the blast, his vision remained adjusted to the dark. Axton moved swiftly. He grabbed a length of heavy 550 paracord he kept spooled by the coat rack. As Caleb stepped forward to inspect the couch, Axton dropped to a crouch, swept his leg out, and caught Caleb's boots. Caleb hit the floor hard, his chin slamming against the oak floorboards. The Remington 870 clattered out of his grasp, sliding under the heavy cast-iron wood stove. Before Caleb could even groan, Axton's heavy boot came down squarely on Caleb's right wrist, pinning it to the floor. Axton didn't break the bone, but the pressure was agonizing. "Ah! My arm!" Caleb shrieked. Toby, paralyzed by fear, didn't shoot. He couldn't even see where Caleb was. "Caleb!" Axton leaned down his face mere inches from Caleb's ear. "You brought a shotgun into a man's sanctuary." Axton whispered the cold steel of his Ka bar knife, gently pressing against Caleb's sweaty cheek. "That was your second mistake." Axton kicked Caleb hard in the ribs, sending the larger man rolling backward in pain, then vanished back into the shadows. Caleb scrambled away, crawling toward the front door on his hands and knees, clutching his ribs, totally disarmed and completely broken. "Toby." Caleb wheezed, tasting copper in his mouth. "Run, just run." But Toby couldn't run, because as he turned toward the broken window, Axton stepped out from the shadows, bathed in the faint, silvery moonlight reflecting off the snow outside. Axton wasn't pointing a gun at Toby. He was just standing there, massive and unmovable, the customized Kimber, 1911, resting easily against his thigh, his eyes locked onto the terrified 19-year-old. "Your friend is leaving," Axton said, his voice entirely devoid of anger, which somehow made it infinitely more terrifying. "What are you going to do, son?" Toby looked at the rusted Smith & Wesson in his trembling hands. He looked at the hulking silhouette of the veteran. His mind finally snapped under the immense crushing pressure of the psychological siege. With a pathetic sob, Toby dropped the gun. It hit the floor with a heavy clunk. He fell to his knees, putting his hands behind his head. "Please," Toby cried, tears freezing on his cheeks. "Please don't kill me. We didn't know." Axton didn't move to strike him. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out his Garmin satellite phone, and hit the preset button for the Ravalli County Sheriff's dispatcher. He had neutralized a 3-man armed element without firing a single shot, and the cops weren't even aware a crime was in progress yet. Axton kicked the rusted Smith & Wesson away from Toby's trembling knees, the heavy metal skittering across the floorboards and disappearing under the sofa. He did not yell. He did not rush. Moving with the methodical, unhurried precision of a man who had spent a lifetime operating in hostile environments, Axton reached into the cargo pocket of his trousers and withdrew a handful of heavy-duty flex cuffs. "Hands behind your back, son," Axton instructed, his voice, a low, gravelly baritone that cut right through the whistling wind outside. Toby obeyed instantly, sobbing uncontrollably. The 19-year-old thrust his hands behind his back, his wrists crossing over each other in absolute surrender. Axton secured the thick plastic ties, pulling them tight enough to hold, but stopping just short of cutting off circulation. He grabbed Toby by the collar of his cheap flannel jacket and dragged him effortlessly toward the kitchen, sitting him down against the heavy cast-iron base of the antique wood stove. Out on the front porch, the situation for Caleb was rapidly deteriorating. The adrenaline that had fueled his initial assault was crashing hard, leaving him fully exposed to the agonizing throb in his ribs and the crushing pain in his right wrist. He dragged himself across the snow-covered planks, desperate to reach the tree line, but the Bitterroot blizzard was unforgiving. The temperature had plummeted to -12 degrees. The wind was a physical force, biting through his thin Carhartt jacket like shattered glass. Caleb realized with sudden, terrifying clarity that even if he made it to the truck, he had dropped the keys inside the cabin during the scuffle. He was going to freeze to death in the middle of nowhere. A shadow fell over him. Axton stood in the doorway, indifferent to the freezing gales whipping his grey hair. He reached down, grabbed Caleb by the scruff of his jacket with one massive hand, and hauled the heavy man back inside as easily as if he were carrying a stray dog. Axton dumped Caleb onto the center of the living room rug, slamming the reinforced front door shut against the storm. With the power still out, Axton walked over to a wooden cabinet, retrieved a vintage Coleman kerosene lantern, and lit it. The harsh, brilliant white glare illuminated the wreckage of the living room, the shattered window pane, the couch stuffing scattered like snow and the terrified faces of the men who had come to ruin his peace. Axton pulled up a sturdy wooden dining chair and sat backward, resting his forearms on the backrest. He looked at Caleb, who was clutching his ribs and shivering violently on the floor. In the pantry, Lenny was finally starting to groan, waking up from the carotid chokehold, entirely immobilized by the industrial duct tape. "You boys made a profound miscalculation tonight," Axton said softly, his steely grey eyes locked onto Caleb. "But what bothers me isn't your incompetence. It's your confidence. Tweakers looking for a quick score don't drive 30 miles out of Missoula into a severe weather system to hit a reinforced cabin without a guarantee. Someone pointed you here." Caleb ground his teeth, refusing to meet Axton's gaze. "Nobody pointed us anywhere. We heard rumors. That's it." Axton shook his head slowly. He stood up, towering over Caleb, and placed the toe of his tactical moccasin gently against Caleb's injured ribs. He didn't kick. He merely applied a steady, gradual pressure. Caleb gasped, his face twisting in sudden agony. "Okay, stop. Please." "A perimeter breach requires intelligence," Axton stated calmly, easing the pressure slightly. "You knew the exact location of the telecom line. You knew the layout of the access road. You bypassed 3 other wealthy vacation properties down the valley to come directly to the end of the line. Who gave you the intel?" Toby, weeping against the wood stove, cracked immediately. "Tell him, Caleb. Just tell him." "He's gonna kill us." "Shut up, Toby," Caleb hissed, spitting onto the floorboards. Axton sighed, a sound of genuine disappointment. He knelt beside Caleb, pulling his K-bar knife from its sheath. The blade gleamed menacingly in the harsh white light of the Coleman lantern. Axton didn't threaten to cut him. Instead, he smoothly sliced open the breast pocket of Caleb's jacket, extracting a burner cell phone. "I don't need you to tell me," Axton murmured, flipping the cheap plastic phone open. "I spent 4 years in intelligence reconnaissance. I can rip the SIM card access, the localized tower pings, and trace the outgoing burner logs in about 15 minutes. Caleb stared at the veteran, a profound sense of dread washing over him. This wasn't an old hermit. This was an apex predator who had been politely pretending to be retired. "It was Briggs," Caleb blurted out, his voice cracking with defeat. "Donovan Briggs, the county land commissioner." Axton's eyes narrowed slightly, but his expression remained entirely composed. Donovan Briggs. The puzzle pieces instantly snapped together in Axton's calculating mind. For the past 6 months, Briggs had been aggressively attempting to purchase Axton's 300 acres of pristine timberland. Briggs was pushing a massive commercial resort development, but Axton's property sat squarely in the middle of the proposed access route. Axton had repeatedly refused to sell, even reporting Briggs to the State Environmental Board for illegal logging practices near the property line. "Briggs told us you had $500,000 in untraceable cash in a floor safe," Caleb continued, hyperventilating as the truth poured out. "He gave us the map. He showed us where the telecom wire was. He said if anything went wrong, if we had to put you down, he'd make sure the sheriff's investigation went away. He wanted you gone." Axton stared at the flickering lantern light. It wasn't just a home invasion. It was an assassination attempt disguised as a botched robbery orchestrated by a corrupt county official using desperate junkies as disposable pawns. Axton pocketed the burner phone. The dynamic of the night had fundamentally shifted. He was no longer just defending his home. He was gathering actionable intelligence on a high-level local threat. The wait was grueling, a true test of psychological endurance. For 3 hours the blizzard hammered the cabin, burying the unpaved logging road under 2 feet of snow. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense, but entirely controlled by the veteran. Axton didn't tie Caleb to a chair. He simply ordered the injured man to sit in the corner of the room, facing the wall. Caleb, utterly broken and terrified of the silent, lethal older man, didn't dare move a single muscle. Every time the wind rattled the broken window, Toby flinched. Lenny remained silent in the pantry, wide awake, and acutely aware of his own helplessness. In a bizarre display of stoic discipline, Axton actually placed an old aluminum kettle on the wood stove. When it whistled, he brewed a cup of chamomile tea, sitting quietly in his armchair, his Kimber 1911 resting on the table beside him. He offered a cup to Toby, who was shivering violently. "Drink," Axton commanded softly. "You're going into shock." Toby took the warm mug with bound hands, sipping awkwardly, crying silent tears into the steaming liquid. He looked at Axton, not as a victim, but as a terrifying savior who had spared his life. It was nearly 4 a.m. when the rhythmic sweep of red and blue emergency lights finally sliced through the swirling snow outside. The heavy rumble of specialized snow-tracked police vehicles echoed up the driveway. Sheriff Dale Lawson, a 20-year veteran of Ravalli County, kicked his way through the deep snow, accompanied by 3 heavily armed deputies. They approached the cabin with their weapons drawn, expecting the absolute worst. A disconnected 911 call from a satellite phone originating from Axton Sanders's residence usually meant tragedy. Lawson knew Axton's background. He knew the man was capable of extreme violence if provoked. "Sheriff's Department," Lawson bellowed, kicking the front door open, his tactical flashlight piercing the darkness of the cabin. What the deputies saw stopped them dead in their tracks. There was no carnage. There were no bodies. Instead, they found Caleb Wyatt, sitting quietly in the corner, holding his injured ribs, looking like a reprimanded child. Toby Henderson was sitting by the stove, bound but entirely unharmed, sipping tea. Lenny was neatly packaged in duct tape in the pantry. As the deputies swept the room, Toby looked up at Sheriff Lawson and burst into hysterical, relieved tears. "Thank God!" Toby cried, struggling to his feet. "Please arrest us. Put us in the cruiser. Just get us away from him. Please!" Sheriff Lawson lowered his weapon, utterly bewildered. He watched as his deputies quickly took custody of the 3 men who offered zero resistance. In fact, they practically threw themselves into the handcuffs, desperate to be taken to the safety of a concrete jail cell. Axton Sanders was standing by the kitchen counter, casually pouring the last of the tea into his mug. He looked at the sheriff with a calm, unreadable expression. "Evening, Dale," Axton said quietly. "Took you boys long enough. Storm's bad art." Lawson replied, holstering his sidearm and taking off his snow-covered Stetson. He surveyed the shattered window, the shotgun blast in the couch, and the terrified criminals being escorted out. "Looks like you had a busy night. You okay?" "I'm perfectly fine," Axton replied. He walked over to the wooden table and picked up the burner phone he had extracted from Caleb. He handed it to the sheriff. "What's this?" Lawson asked, examining the cheap plastic device. "That is the end of Donovan Briggs's political career," Axton stated, his voice devoid of any dramatic inflection. "And likely his freedom. Those boys didn't come here by accident, Dale. Briggs gave them the perimeter layout, the telecom schematics, and a promise of immunity if they killed me. He used them to try and force the land sale." Lawson's jaw tightened. The rumors about Briggs being corrupt had circulated through the county for years, but no one had ever been able to pin anything concrete on the slick politician. "You sure about this, Art?" "Run the call logs," Axton said, turning his back to clean his coffee mug in the sink. "You'll find outgoing calls from that burner directly to Briggs's personal cell phone. Then I suggest you put Caleb Wyatt in an interrogation room and offer him a plea deal. He's ready to sing like a canary." Lawson looked at the silent, stoic veteran, a deep sense of respect washing over him. Axton had not only defended his home and spared the lives of 3 desperate young men, but he had systematically dismantled a local corruption ring without firing a single bullet. "I'll have a crew come up tomorrow to help you board up that window," Lawson offered gently. "Appreciate it, Dale," Axton replied, not looking up from the sink. "Close the door tight on your way out. It's getting chilly." As the police cruisers slowly rolled back down the snow-covered logging road, taking the broken criminals and the crucial evidence with them, Axton Sanders was finally alone again. The Bitterroot Valley returned to its natural, profound silence. The retired Force Recon sniper walked back to the living room, picked up his weather radio, and sat down in the velvet dark. He was a man of peace, but heaven help the wolves, who forgot he was the one who guarded the forest. In a world where predators search for easy prey, they often forget that the quietest corners hide the strongest guardians. Axton Sanders's Night of Terror turned into a masterclass of psychological warfare and ultimate justice. If this intense tale of survival, tactical brilliance, and exposing corruption kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button, share this incredible true-to-life story with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling real-world drama.